All right, so I want you to watch this video in preparation for our lesson on lesson 2 is how do we develop economic principles, okay? And in the lesson, you're going to learn the difference between what we call purposeful action and mindless behavior, the difference, and we've already touched on it a little bit, between social science and natural science, and why the methods are used to develop basic economics are different from those in physics and chemistry, all right? So let's get into this book, the chapter here. I'm going to give you the overview so that when we read it in class, some of it will make sense to you. Robert Murphy talks about the difference between purposeful action and between mindless behavior. And purposeful action is basically when you think about doing something, you have a purpose for what you're going to do, and you do it. Whereas as he calls it, mindless behavior is when things happen and there's no thought given to it, there's no plan, for example, okay? So he gives the idea like between the two things, like your knee, you know, if I say to you, hey, if you'll take your leg from your knee up and lift it up like that, I'll give you $20. You do it. See, there was a reason you did it. Why? I'm going to give you $20, so you do that. But if you go to the doctor and he taps your knee, and if you tap your knee in the right spot, the rest of your leg will reflex and come up. That's mindless behavior, okay? It just happens, okay? So purposeful action is when there's some thought, there's some intellect behind and purpose behind what you're going to do. And so the lessons in the book apply to purposeful action and not so much mindless behavior. So that's one of the things that he wants to talk about, that he talks about in the book. Then there's this whole thing of social science versus natural sciences. And we've already touched on it a little bit, and we'll be covering that in class. I'll be introducing it between pages 15 and 16. And there again, social science relates to people, and therefore whenever you're dealing with people, we're talking about purposeful action. Whereas when you deal with natural science, where you're measuring and testing things, all right, that's more of the mindless behavior, all right? That's what he's talking about as I look at page 15. The natural, he says, in sharp contrast, with the notable exception of biology, the natural scientist typically doesn't refer to conscious intelligence when explaining his field of expertise. So a lot of natural sciences, when they deal with some of their theories, they're not thinking that there's intelligence involved, okay? A lot of natural science are not believers in God. And so they think that there's an order and things happen just naturally, mindlessly, according to this plan, all right? According to this method. There's no intelligence behind it. There's no purpose behind it. It just happens. That's the way things work, all right? But social sciences, when you're dealing with people in economics or psychology, whenever you're dealing with people, then we find that, yeah, there's purposes behind things. And I really believe that in our world, in the area of economics, which is a social science relating to people, that God is the creator, and that God has a plan, and God has ordered things, and things happen for God's purposes. There are purposeful actions that happen because God has planned them that way. So that's what Robert Murphy is talking about, pages 15 and 16. He talks about, in 17, the social science, the success of natural sciences versus the social sciences, and we'll be reading that in class. But there again, it's more of this purpose versus mindless action, all right? And he talks about, I guess we'll discuss that in class, okay? I think you got the idea between purposeful action and mindless action, and we will talk about that in class, all right? He talks about Keynesians, deficits, and Austrians, and even in the area of economics. Keynesians are people who basically believe that government should get involved in running things, running the economy, and so on. And that's because of a man by the name of, that we'll study later, John Maynard Keynes. And he came around during the Great Depression, the 1930s. He was from Great Britain, and he had some ideas and some theories. and and people who follow him, they're called Keynesians, economists, okay? And they basically see that things aren't going to always get better the way they should, so government people need to get involved and start manipulating the economy, all right? That's Keynesian. Austrian, the school of Austrian, which is what we're studying economics, says that there's a divine order, and if you just let the divine order, the free market, if you just let things go and continue, it's not perfect, but things will, over time, shift gears and change. You'll learn later on that there's a thing that we call laissez-faire, the invisible hand in the market, and the economy will function normally and properly because it was created, the market, the free market, that whole idea of exchanges was created by God, and it's not perfect because you got people like us involved, but there's an order to it and plan to it, and that's what Austrians teach, and that's the definition with Austrians. And then there's deficits. The word deficit just simply means when somebody, in this case the government, spends more money than they take in. It means you're in the hole. You're minus. It's a deficit. And so he talks about that. And then he spends the last part of the chapter, how do we develop basic economics? And that is, he compares economics a little bit with geometry. In geometry, he gives you some examples. When you have a model, you have like a triangle, and it has, this side has a degree, and this side has a degree. In fact, it's on page 24. There's side A, bottom side B, side C, and it's called the Pythagorean theorem, and I was not great, by the way, in geometry, but the Pythagorean theorem says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now keep in mind, economics, I told you, I promised you, it's not about math, but the point is that that is always true. You don't have to go back out and test and measure things. If you have this particular angle, then it'll always be true. It will always be true. You don't need to test it. You can apply it to different things and it will always be true. I remember one time in a house that my wife and I owned many years ago in another place, I was putting in a drop ceiling, and I had ceiling tiles, and I had this angle, and I had to cut my ceiling tile at an angle, and I wasn't sure what the angle should be. My niece was a math major. She was there. She's a school teacher. So she came over and I said, how do I cut this angle so it's correct? And she used the Pythagorean theory, and she knew what the theory was. It's always true. And she says, cut it like this, and I cut it like that, and it was perfect. So now, that relates to economics, meaning there are certain laws of economics that you don't have to test once you know what one law is. For example, the law of demand. The law of demand says that as prices go down, people buy more things. That's always true. You don't have to go back and test it and measure it, and you can find throughout life different instances in which that's true, okay? So that's how you study economics. It has laws that, and you don't have to go back and test and remeasure these laws. You can apply them to many different areas of life. And that is what we call, the other term is called an axiom, all right? An axiom, all right? And an axiom is what I just said. You have a starting assumption. If this is true, and we call this deductive reasoning, if this is true and this is true, then you'll always get this. If it's a squared plus b squared, you'll always get c squared, all right? And that's called deductive reasoning. If this is true and this is true, then this has got to be true, all right? And so that's how it works in geometry, and it works that way in economics too. So that's kind of the big picture about Chapter 2. We talk about purposeful action versus mindless action. We talk about the differences between the natural sciences and the social sciences, and then we talk about deductive logic and reasoning, and how economics is like geometry. If this is true and this is true, then this is always true, and that's why you don't have to go back through and always test things. With economics, you know the law, you know the theory, you can just apply those to other things. So I hope this is helpful to you. I'm just doing these overviews. I know this is a long overview, sorry about that. But this is an overview just to get you into the text so that you get a basic idea of when we start reading some of these things. All right? And so read through chapter 2 ahead of time if you want. We'll read it in class. And then as always, we're going to write out the terms, and we're going to do the study questions. We'll team up with the study questions, and all of that, of course, will be on the Google Classroom later in the week. All right? So that's chapter 2, and I'll be working on chapter 3 very shortly.